There are voices that fill a room, and there are voices that fill an era. In the 1960s, two of those voices belonged to men who could not have been more different. One spoke in poetry and idealism. The other moved in instinct and electricity. One believed music could save the world through thought. The other believed it could shake the world through the body. For a brief, charged moment in history, those two forces looked at each other across the landscape of rock and roll. And what passed between them was not. It was something sharper, something colder, something that neither man would ever fully resolve. This is not the story of two enemies. It is the story of two giants who could not quite understand each other, and what that misunderstanding cost them both, and what it revealed about the nature of fame, art, and the hunger to be the most important voice in the room. But before we get there, we have to go back to the beginning, because nothing about this tension was accidental. It was built slowly from the ground up, from two very different versions of what rock and roll was supposed to be. It was 1962 in London, and the music scene was electric with possibility. The Beatles had just begun their meteoric rise from Liverpool club dates to national attention. John Lennon, the sharp-tongued, intellectually restless guitarist and singer at the center of that group, had already developed a reputation not just for his music but for his wit. A wit that could be generous and warm but could also be surgical and dismissive. Lennon had an instinct for hierarchy. He understood better than almost anyone around him the importance of being first, being the standard by which others were measured. And in 1962, the Beatles were becoming that standard with terrifying speed. Meanwhile, in South London, a group of young men with a shared obsession for American blues records were doing something that looked, from a distance, almost identical to what the Beatles were doing, but felt, up close, completely different. The Rolling Stones were raw in a way the Beatles were not. They were louder, messier, angrier. And at the front of that band was a young man named Michael Philip Jagger. Mick to everyone who knew him. A student at the London School of Economics who had no business being one of the most compelling performers in England but was becoming exactly that regardless. Mick Jagger did not look dangerous. Not at first. He was thin, almost gangly, with lips that seemed slightly too large for his face and eyes that took everything in while giving very little back. He was the son of a physical education teacher from Dartford, educated, thoughtful, curious about the world in ways that did not fit the image he was beginning to construct for himself on stage. But on stage, something happened to Mick Jagger that did not have a clean explanation. He moved in ways that young men in England in 1962 simply did not move. He took the vocabulary of American blues and rhythm and blues performers, the looseness, the physicality, the suggestion of something dangerous and free, and translated it through his own body into something that audiences could not categorize and therefore could not look away from. John Lennon noticed. Of course he noticed. Lennon noticed everything. And what he noticed about Mick Jagger in those early years was not simple admiration. It was something more complicated, a mixture of recognition, curiosity, and something that looked, if you examined it carefully, a great deal like competitive unease. The two worlds existed in parallel for a time, circling each other with the careful politeness of people who know they are competing, but have not yet decided to acknowledge it openly. The Beatles and the Rolling Stones were often discussed in the same breath, which was both accurate and misleading. They shared a love of American music. They shared an England that was hungry for youth and energy and noise after the gray austerity of the post-war years. But the similarities ended there. The Beatles, particularly in their early years, wore matching suits. The Rolling Stones wore whatever they wanted. The Beatles smiled for photographers. The Rolling Stones scowled. The Beatles had a manager who understood image control and public relations with almost frightening precision. The Rolling Stones had a manager who understood that the best publicity was the kind that made respectable people uncomfortable. And then came the moment that began to define the friction between Lennon and Jagger specifically. It was not a dramatic confrontation. It was something smaller and in some ways more damaging. A comment, a private remark that moved through the music world the way private remarks always do when the people making them are famous enough that their private thoughts become public property. John Lennon, in conversation with people he trusted, made his feelings about Mick Jagger known. The precise wording changed depending on who was recounting it and when, but the substance remained consistent across multiple accounts from people who were present in various configurations of that social world. Lennon found Jagger's voice limited. He found Jagger's dancing, the thing that was becoming Jagger's most powerful tool. Theatrical in a way that Lennon considered hollow, and he found Jagger's ambition, the naked, unapologetic hunger to be enormous, to be somehow less sophisticated than it should have been. In Lennon's private taxonomy of rock and roll, Jagger was talented but not deep, energetic but not meaningful, a performer, not an artist. These were not small criticisms. In the world they both inhabited, the distinction between performer and artist was the distinction between someone who entertained and someone who mattered. Lennon saw himself, without false modesty, as someone who mattered. He believed, and the record would largely vindicate this belief, that his songs were saying something that needed to be said, that the Beatles were not simply providing entertainment, but were participating in something genuinely important, culturally and historically. Maybe in his private assessment, Mick Jagger was not doing the same thing. Jagger was putting on a show, a very good show. Lennon might have conceded, but a show nonetheless. What Lennon perhaps did not fully account for was that Mick Jagger was listening, not just to the music, not just to the critics, not just to the audiences, but to everything. Jagger had a quality that people who knew him often described with some variation of the word watchful. He absorbed information. He processed it. He did not react quickly or visibly, which could be mistaken for passivity but was, in fact, something more like strategy. When word of Lennon's private assessments reached him, and in a world that's small, they inevitably did, Jagger did not respond publicly. He did not call a press conference. He did not write a sharp letter. He did not even, as far as anyone could tell, discuss it extensively with the people around him. He went back to work, and the work through the mid-1960s was extraordinary. The Rolling Stones were building a catalog that was beginning to rival anything in popular music for sheer force. Songs came that hit with the weight of something physical, a track that arrived in 1965 with a guitar riff so instantly recognizable that it became shorthand for rock and roll itself. A sound that seemed to crystallize the frustration and desire of an entire generation into a single opening chord. Then came a darker, stranger piece of work, something that painted the world in colors that were almost threatening, hypnotic in a way that unsettled people who thought they understood what pop music was supposed to do. Then a survivor's anthem, ragged and triumphant, the sound of someone who has been through something terrible and come out the other side, not healed exactly but standing. Then a recording that opened with orchestral grandeur before descending into something that felt genuinely transgressive. A narrator who identified with darkness not to celebrate it, but to illuminate it, to hold a mirror to the part of human nature that polite society preferred not to acknowledge. These were not the recordings of someone who was merely putting on a show. John Lennon, to his considerable credit, was not a man who maintained positions when the evidence argued against them. He was combative and proud, but he was also honest in ways that could be painful to himself as well as others. As the 1960s progressed and the full weight of what the Rolling Stones were producing became impossible to dismiss, Lennon's private assessments began to shift. Not dramatically, not in any single moment of sudden conversion, but gradually the way real understanding actually arrives. Slowly, reluctantly, with a certain irritation at having been wrong. There were conversations in the mid-1960s some of which have been documented by people who were present, in which Lennon spoke about Jagger and the Rolling Stones with a respect that had not been present in the earlier remarks. He acknowledged the catalog. He acknowledged the live performances, which were becoming events of a scale and intensity that even the Beatles, who had largely stopped performing live by 1966, could not easily dismiss. He acknowledged, in the careful language of one competitive genius assessing another, that Jagger had done something real. But acknowledgement and friendship are not the same thing. And the relationship between John Lennon and Mick Jagger was never precisely friendship. It was closer to something like professional respect crossed with permanent wariness. The kind of relationship that exists between two people who understand each other's ambitions because they share them, and who therefore understand exactly what the other person is capable of in ways that make genuine trust difficult. What did Jagger himself make of all this? Here is where the story becomes genuinely interesting, because Jagger's response to the entire dynamic, to the dismissals, to the comparisons, to the question of whether the Rolling Stones were equals to the Beatles or permanently subordinate to them, was in many ways the most revealing thing about his character. He did not chase Lennon's approval. He did not attempt to reposition the Rolling Stones as something more intellectual or more literary or more respectable. He did the opposite. He leaned further into what the Rolling Stones were, into the danger and the physicality and the refusal to apologize, and he did it with a discipline and a consistency that was, when examined closely, the opposite of wild. It was controlled. It was strategic. It was in its own way as calculated as anything Lennon was doing. The Rolling Stones in the late 1960s were not simply a band. They were a position, a statement about what rock and roll was and what it should be allowed to do. Jagger had understood something about the music that Lennon, for all his intelligence, had perhaps not fully absorbed, that the body was as important as the mind, that rhythm was as meaningful as lyric, that the experience of a live performance could communicate things that a recording, no matter how brilliant, could not fully replicate. Lennon's genius was largely on tape in the studio, in the architecture of songs that would endure for generations. Jagger's genius was most fully alive in real time, in the space between himself and a crowd, in the feedback loop of energy and response that made a Rolling Stones concert something that people who attended them struggled to describe adequately afterward. By the time the decade turned, both men were navigating the strange territory that comes after extraordinary early success. The question of what comes next when you have already done the thing you were supposed to do. For Lennon, this meant the Beatles coming apart, painfully and publicly, and then a solo career in which he attempted to strip music down to its most honest and vulnerable elements. For Jagger, it meant the Rolling Stones continuing, sometimes triumphantly, sometimes in genuine crisis, through the 1970s and beyond. There was a particular moment in 1971 that people who followed both careers closely noted with interest. Lennon had released his most celebrated solo work, a record that was stark and confessional and emotionally devastating in its directness. It was, by almost any measure, one of the great rock recordings, personal, political, sonically innovative. Jagger, watching from his own considerable vantage point, acknowledged it for what it was. He did not diminish it. He did not compete with it directly. He simply noted, in the way he noted most things, that Lennon had found something true and expressed it with uncommon courage. And then the Rolling Stones released a record that same year that moved in an entirely different direction. Sprawl. Loose, celebratory, dangerous in different ways. A record made in an exile that produced something that felt both dissolute and vital. The two records existed in different universes stylistically, and yet both were undeniably significant. And both came from men who had been told, at various points in their careers, that they were not quite the real thing. The dynamic between Lennon and Jagger was complicated further by the fact that they moved in overlapping social worlds. while maintaining careful distances from each other personally. They attended some of the same events, knew many of the same people, were aware of each other's work in the way that competitors who respect each other are always aware, not casually, but with attention, with the particular kind of focus that only arrives when the subject genuinely matters. There were encounters, brief and documented, in which the two men were warm to each other, in the way that people who have a complicated history are warm when the cameras are present, correctly, professionally, without giving anything important away. What Lennon thought of Jagger by the mid-1970s is harder to reconstruct than what he thought in the early years, partly because Lennon had retreated significantly from public life, and partly because the Lennon of the mid-1970s was a different person than the sharp, combative figure of the 1960s, quieter, more reflective, less interested in the competitive hierarchies of the music world that had consumed so much of his earlier energy. Whether he revisited his early assessments of Jagger, whether he recognized in Jagger's continued dominance something that his earlier dismissals had failed to account for, is not something that can be stated with certainty. What can be said is that by the time of Lennon's death in December of 1980, the two men had arrived at something like mutual recognition, not identical in its terms, not free of the old tensions, but genuine in the way that recognition between serious artists can be genuine even when it arrives late. Mick Jagger's response to Lennon's death was public and measured, and those who knew him felt genuine in its grief. Whatever the complexity of their relationship, whatever the private competitions and the public comparisons, and the decades of existing in each other's shadow in different configurations at different times, Lennon had been one of the only people in the world who could understand, in a real and specific way, what it felt like to be Mick Jagger. Not the fame exactly. Many people understood fame in the abstract, but the particular quality of that fame, the weight of being a symbol as well as a person, the exhaustion and the exhilaration of having your face and your voice become something that belongs to the world rather than to yourself. Lennon had known that, and now he was gone. Jagger continued. That was, in many ways, the final answer to everything Lennon had ever said about him. Not as a rebuttal, not as a triumph over a rival, but simply as a fact. Mick Jagger continued. Through the 1980s, through years in which rock was declared dead or irrelevant multiple times by people who turned out to be wrong, through personal upheavals and creative arguments, and the general entropy that destroys most bands long before they reach middle age, the Rolling Stones continued to exist, continued to tour, continued to be a force that filled stadiums on every continent. Jagger aged in public, which rock stars were not supposed to do, and refused to apologize for it, which they were definitely not supposed to do. There is a version of the story of John Lennon and Mick Jagger that is simply a story of rivalry. Two men competing for the same crown, one who died young and one who kept going, the tragic genius versus the enduring showman. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is insufficient. It misses the more interesting truth, which is that both men were attempting, through their work, to answer the same fundamental question about what popular music was for. Lennon believed it was for truth, for stripping away pretense and reaching something essential and human underneath. Jagger believed it was for experience, for creating a physical and emotional event that moved people in ways they could not fully articulate or rationalize. Neither answer was complete without the other. The greatest music, the kind that endures across generations and cultures, usually contains both. What John Lennon missed in his early dismissal of Jagger was that Jagger understood something about the relationship between performer and audience that was its own kind of truth. The body on stage does not lie, not to the thousands of people watching, who can sense immediately when someone is going through the motions versus when someone is completely present. Jagger's presence was and remained total. That totality was not a trick. It was a discipline, and underneath the discipline was a genuine belief in what he was doing, a belief that the moment on stage, the shared moment between performer and crowd, was meaningful in ways that could not be reduced to lyrics or chord progressions. What Jagger might have missed in his careful watchfulness of Lennon was that Lennon's vulnerability, the thing that made his work occasionally uncomfortable, the willingness to expose the confusion and anger and tenderness underneath the public figure, was itself a form of performance courage that Jagger rarely allowed himself. Jagger's emotional armor was formidable. It protected him, and it also kept certain kinds of artistic intimacy at arm's length. Lennon had gone somewhere that Jagger, for all his gifts, did not often go. Both things are true. Both men had blind spots that were shaped precisely by their greatest strengths. And both men created work that will last as long as anyone is interested in what the 20th century sounded like at its most. The story of John Lennon and Mick Jagger is not ultimately a story about who won. It is a story about two extraordinary human beings who existed at the same moment in history, who circled each other for 2 decades with a mixture of respect and rivalry and incomprehension, and who between them helped define the possibilities of what popular music could be and do and mean. They were not friends in the simple sense. They were not enemies in any useful sense either. They were something rarer and more complicated, contemporaries who saw in each other the measure of their own ambition, and who spent their careers trying to exceed it. John Lennon died in December of 1980 at the age of 40. He was shot outside his home in New York City, and the world mourned in a way that confirmed everything he had believed about the reach and importance of his work. The grief was global, immediate, and genuine. It was the grief not just for a person, but for a voice, for a perspective, for a way of understanding the world through music that had become inseparable from the era in which it was created. Mick Jagger stood on stages for decades after that. He turned 70, then 75, then 80, and each time the question arose, is this finally the end? Has rock and roll finally run out of body? He answered it the same way he had always answered every challenge in his career, not with words, with movement, with presence, with the refusal to concede that the thing he had devoted his life to was finished. In the end, what John Lennon said about Mick Jagger in those early years, that he was a performer rather than an artist, turned out to be both true and beside the point. Jagger was a performer, but performance at its highest level, at the level Jagger sustained it across 6 decades of public life, is itself an art. It requires gifts that cannot be faked and cannot be taught and cannot be borrowed. It requires the willingness to stand in front of other human beings, night after night, decade after decade, and give them something that makes the fact of being alive feel larger and more electric and more worth the trouble. Mick Jagger gave people that. Whatever John Lennon thought of it, whatever any critic or competitor or casual observer thought of it, the people who were there, in the clubs in the early 1960s, in the stadiums in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s and beyond, knew what they had witnessed. They did not need it explained to them. They felt it in their bodies, which is exactly where Mick Jagger always intended it to land, and that, in the end, is the most complete answer to every dismissal, every private remark, every careful hierarchy of who mattered more and who would last longer and whose work would mean more to the future. The answer is not in the argument, it is in the experience. It is in every person who left a Rolling Stones concert and found the night air sharper and the world more vivid and the fact of being alive more undeniable than it had been 3 hours before. That was what Mick Jagger was doing all along, not despite the criticism, not in response to it, simply because it was the most true thing he knew how to do.